What's up, UX fam? How's your mom and them? Welcome to another episode of Beyond UX Design. I'm Jeremy. If you're new here, welcome to the show. I am super stoked to have you. Have you picked up your paperback copy of Beyond UX Design, Master Your Craft, Beyond Pixels and Prototypes yet? Unlock the secrets of UX success and learn all the things they didn't teach you in school. Get free shipping on all orders over $30 and use the code LISTENER to get 10% off your entire order. Head on over to beyonduxdesign.com/book to learn more. Are you feeling stuck in a low design maturity environment? Are you unsure how to demonstrate the true value of your work? Femke's Product Strategy for Designers course is here to help. And in just 6 weeks, Femke's course will help you enhance your strategic influence and tackle product challenges with confidence. Join over 400 designers who have already transformed their careers with expert videos, live calls, and interactive projects. Cohort 6 starts on March 3rd, 2025, and seats are limited. Don't wait. Visit beyonduxdesign.com/strategy to enroll today. And if you haven't done it already, please consider subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you are a regular here and you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would really appreciate you leaving a 5-star review. That'll help me out so much more than you can imagine. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, and Adina for all their support. And if you want to join these fine folks and many others and help keep the show independent and ad-free, you'll get exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. You can get instant access to the video archives right now for as little as $5 a month. That's a steal. And for more information on how you can support the show and help more people find out about what we're doing, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/support. And of course, if you think the show is worth sharing, then I would love it if you told your mom and them. As a cisgendered old white dude, the way that I am treated at work, I think, is often very different from the way that women are treated at work, and especially women who also are minorities and just minorities and males in general are treated very differently than I might be. And so I could sit up here on my soapbox in this podcast and talk all about how you should or shouldn't react in certain situations. But I think it's also important to get the perspective of a woman, of a minority, and understand how they approach corporate culture, which is why I am incredibly excited to have my good friend Karen Manhas on the show. We have been talking for, Karen, I don't know how long, trying to get you on the show. We have rescheduled. Karen's journey from engineering to UX is driven by curiosity and a passion for solving complex problems. Based in London, she spent the past 5 years working across a range of companies from corporate giants to startups, where she's focused on improving enterprise UX and championing self-advocacy. And outside of her work, Karen volunteers with Ladies at UX London, attends design events in the city, and shares her knowledge by creating UX design templates on Miroverse. Probably lives a bit too much on LinkedIn. I know the feeling, Karen, which is where we met, by the way. Thank God for LinkedIn. It's good for some things. Karen, welcome to Beyond UX Design. I am so excited to have you on, and I'm very interested in getting your perspective today on how you've handled a lot of the things that we're going to talk about. So, Karen, welcome to Beyond UX Design. How's it going?
It's going marvelously. I feel as if there's going to be a lot of words thrown in there that's not in the everyday conversation. So yes, marvelous.
Marvelous. I'm going to try very hard to not do the British accent today. Sometimes I do it just to be funny, but it's probably not funny for you.
No, because people tell me I have an American accent.
What?
So I'm very curious to know if I start from British and I go all the way to American.
You definitely don't sound like you're from Alabama. I guess It depends what part of America we're talking about. Told a side story. My kids, sometimes they will pretend to have a British accent, and the only thing that they'll say British, like which is, you just said it similar to, and it made me think of that.
Some people
my kids.
say water.
What is that?
Sometimes people don't pronounce the T.
What?
So like British.
Karen, I know I read your bio a little bit, but you have had an interesting career, engineering, mechanical engineering, if I'm not mistaken, to software. You've worked in big enterprise, you've worked in startups, and I imagine you've had many experiences from just even being engineering, male-dominated field usually, to software. And so I would love to hear a little bit about that. So tell us a little bit about how you ended up getting from engineering into this and your experience there with the corporate life and everything, and then we'll get started.
I studied mechanical engineering for far too long. Centuries. And I was one of 10 female students out of a cohort of 75.
Oh, God.
And then I did an industrial placement year at a nuclear power plant, and that's how we bonded over
Wow.
GE in Austin, which was really fascinating because in the delivery department, I think it was called, I was the only brown person, I think. I was one of 4 female engineers. And I think in total in that department, I want to say there were only 3 Black people and 1 was female. I think the other 2 were males. So we were just like bonded. It was like us. And it was really fascinating seeing the cultural differences in the office as well. And then I also did a internship at an American aerospace company, which was fascinating because I was the first female engineer in 5 years in that department.
Wow.
And that was quite interesting because I sometimes thought they had no idea how to treat me. They had no
Really?
idea how to talk to me, which makes sense because if it was just Caucasian male dominated and then all of a sudden this fast female engineer woman of color comes out of 5 years, like what do we do? That was really fascinating. And then I went through this 5 stages of grief where I realized mechanical engineering wasn't for me and I didn't want to pursue it post university because failure is not an option in Asian households. I moved into a graduate program it was a technology graduate program in telecoms. And that was my first introduction into a corporate environment. And it was really fascinating because it was my introduction into bureaucracy, office politics. There was a lot of diversity, to be fair, which I absolutely loved. And it was a steep learning curve for me as someone who did not have a background in technology. I got into user experience, randomly allocated my placement. So the story goes is for your final placement, you had to apply. I didn't get my first choice, so I went into the second round. Didn't get my first choice again in the second round. So in the third round, I was randomly allocated a placement, which was user experience. And I guess the rest is history.
Okay.
User experience accidentally found me, or I accidentally fell into user experience. And then I unexpectedly ended up niching and specializing in enterprise. I was in business transformation, working on customer journeys, working on a few other UX projects. And that's where my experience has been in enterprise, funnily enough. It's a really bizarre story because engineering, you don't talk about user experience. Randomly came across it, unexpectedly ended up niching in enterprise UX, and I guess they say the rest is history.
That is awesome. I love it. I want to go back to something you said a minute ago and unpack that because I feel like this is exactly the thing that we came to talk about, which is these people, I'm going to infer that they didn't know how to handle the first woman on their team in 5 years. I don't assume they were being malicious. I assume a lot of them were just probably used to the male jokes. And then suddenly a woman's there and they're not exactly sure how to handle that. And I feel like maybe in software, it might be a little bit different perhaps, but I still feel like there's probably a lot of teams out there, software teams that are male dominated, bro kind of culture. And then a woman comes on and they feel the same way. And I'm curious from your perspective, like, how did you approach that scenario when you landed on this team, a bunch of dudes, no women, they felt uncomfortable perhaps, and they were maybe trying to not insult you. How did you handle that? The follow-up question to that, were you ever able to make it better? Or did it stay awkward the whole time?
I guess nobody else came in, if that makes sense. So once I had left, I don't know if there was another female engineer in terms of an internship, a female engineer on their graduate program, because they had one at the time. For me, what I try to do is I always try to understand the situation that I'm in. And I always try to think about, okay, this is what they're currently doing. I'm going to join the team. I need to be mindful of if something were to happen, so they're cracking jokes and they're cracking inappropriate jokes, which did happen at the nuclear power plant that I worked at, just to be mindful to either to raise it or to leave the room or to make it known, because the problem is that people stay silent, especially the way that I grew up, it was you're not allowed to talk back. You have to do as you're told. You don't want to cause a commotion. You don't want to step out of line, which I'm sure many women can relate to, the color of your skin and being in a minority or whatnot. But for me, I always try to raise points where I can, because it's also an education piece. And if we are not educating people, then how do you expect them to know? So when I was on my graduate program, I was working with, I don't know, I think he was a head of something, bald white guy. And when he met me, I was like, "Hi, I'm Karen." And he's, "Oh, I wasn't expecting that name."
What?
I was like, "What?"
That is so screwed. Like, I can't. Somebody.
I understand it from
bizarre.
his perspective. Maybe he hasn't worked with a brown Karen. I don't know. I just let it go. I was like, you know what, just let it go. And to be fair, he was really nice. He was really lovely. We built up a great relationship. But it also makes me realize sometimes people don't think past the country that they're in. So, for example, Sri Lanka has Christians, right? So you could meet people who are different color skin and they could have a Christian name, for example. So sometimes we're not mindful of the world around us. And yeah, at the time, it did catch me off guard, because in my mind, I'm like, but I'm Karen. Who else am I meant to be?
It's always been my name.
So now I can laugh at it. But at the time, it really did catch me off guard. And I just thought, okay, I probably should have said something at the time and I didn't. But in my engineering days at that aerospace company, I always tried to speak up where I could.
Yeah. All right. What I want to do before we kick off our conversation is level set what we mean when we say corporate culture. I'm curious, just from your perspective, when you think about corporate culture, you've worked a lot in enterprise, but you've also worked at startups. And I find it funny when people say, "Oh, I want to work in a startup because I don't like the politics of big giant companies and stuff," as if there aren't politics in small startups either. I'd love to get your perspective when we talk about corporate culture, as we're talking about how women and minorities exist inside of those corporate cultures, as a frame of reference for the conversation. When we talk about corporate culture, what do you mean by that?
So the corporate companies that I worked at, if we think about it from a quantity perspective, those companies have had minimum of 100,000 employees, and they've had offices around the world. So in my mind, based off my experience, corporate is minimum 100,000 employees. To some extent, you should have offices around the world, because corporate is that sense of business, and the bigger the business, the more, I don't want to say monopoly, but they have a huge market share,
Presence.
right?
Yeah.
Yes, that's the word. And for me, corporate culture is the personality of a company. So in corporate, it is slower pace because there are more people and there's more hoops that you have to jump through, right? There's more departments, there's more organizations, there's just more people. So it's around the ways of working, the collaboration, the way that you communicate, the way that you interact, and also to some extent, the way that you dress as well. And in corporate culture, I do feel that there are more unspoken rules that you just have to try and figure out. And I can share examples of those. And if you do a 180, startups are the opposite, right? Because there's less people, you have more that can be done, you can deliver more, decisions are made completely differently. Let's face it, you dress a bit more informally. So in my mind, that's how I would define corporate culture.
Okay. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and you mentioned like the kind of ways of working and the dynamics, the people, things like that. And I said corporate culture. I probably should have said like company culture and then corporate versus startup. But yeah, that's the thing when I think about this, all the people, the dynamics and who they work with. And what's interesting in a corporation, I've worked for giant multinational conglomerates with offices all over the world, Bangalore, Europe, Southeast Asia, US, across the board. And it's interesting where you still find pockets, though, of that kind of male-dominated, Western-centric perspective, even though they're working with people in a place like India all the time. But you end up almost like with cliques and stuff inside of the groups. And it's interesting, as a white guy in a place like that, you fit into that sort of more Western, you sort of get So I've noticed what's interesting is the in Asia, like in India, for instance, they'll have a clique and like they'll keep to themselves and they won't really go and try to collaborate as often. Time zones obviously make that very difficult, especially from the US to India, where it's often like 12 hours or something. So it's pretty hard to collaborate. And maybe that has something to do with it. But it's interesting, like just sort of being there and dealing with that. And I wanted to get your perspective when you were first starting out as that woman trying to get into that male dominated, or not even get into maybe, but just work with people that are in that clique. What you talked a minute ago about working in that internship with 5 guys. And so how that fit. And you talked a little bit once you were past the internship, because interns are seen as, I don't want to say disposable. Like you only have them for a little amount of time.
I've never thought of internships like that.
Really?
That's interesting.
You know, I'm thinking of it from like the person who deals with the interns all the time.
Yes, that makes sense.
Right? Where like they're only going to be there for a few months. They don't really know what they're doing. I have to train them and teach them, just counting down the days until they're gone. When you become an official member of the team, it's much different. It's more permanent. And I'm curious, what was it like when you were first starting out in your official job, past your internship, dealing with those things? You first started out in startups, or did you first start out in enterprise, or talk a little bit about that journey?
So I started off in corporate. The biggest surprise for me was I'll first start off with bureaucracy. I did not realize how convoluted or complicated it was. And for me, it really opened my eyes to unfairness, because as women and women of color and women minorities, I remember very vividly when I was starting off in the graduate program, and that was a corporate environment. A few of my friends and I, we wanted to try and get the highest rating. So as we know, employees, you get given a rating, end of year review. But for us, it's the end of our placement. So worked really hard, tried to get that impact, delivery. We have to work harder. We have to prove our value more. And I know there's data out there around that. And I remember at the end, and I wish my manager had told me this at the beginning so I didn't work as hard. He said, you're never going to get that rating. Any graduate person who comes into this team will never get that rating. And I thought to myself, why is that? And that's because there are some members of the team who have been there longer, and in order to keep them happy, they get that rating by default.
What?
So that could be
That's weird.
It sounded like to me it was always male. To be fair, our team was made up of different types of male. Some were from Egypt, some were British, but they were male, right? Because most of the team was male. And I thought this was my first taste of bureaucracy, office politics. And I just thought, so why did I work so hard? Like, you could have told me that in the beginning and we could have avoided this entire mess. So that was a very harsh lesson learned. And then when I moved on to my next company, again, that was very corporate between the Americans and the British. We had an offshore engineering team. And this was another very harsh lesson learned, where I learned that just because you work for a Western company or westernized company, that doesn't necessarily mean you share the same values as the company. So in theory, you should, but in reality, it could be different. So I remember I was working with an engineer. We had a great working relationship. He was amazing. We had good dynamics. Whenever he had a UX question, whenever I had an engineering question, we were on teams, like really fantastic, right? This is like the dream. Engineers, UX, working so closely together. And then what had happened was, to be fair, I think maybe I was a bit naive when we start out.
Sure.
And what had happened was there was someone new who joined the team. She was female, again, offshore. They were all based in India. And I think she was struggling. And they were paired together. He was, I believe, impatient, a bit condescending towards her. And she was telling me all of this because we were also, all of us were working on the same project. I thought, I have a good working relationship with him. Let me talk to him. And that's where everything collapsed. He did not like that I had spoken to him about this problem. He didn't like the fact that I was direct. He didn't like any of it. And what I learned is they are quite hierarchical, and maybe that's something I should have noticed. Therefore, I always think that they tend to follow hierarchy. To be fair, regardless of male or female, but I have noticed it's more towards male hierarchy. And I remember at the time my mentor said that you should never have jeopardized your working relationship because now it's all a mess now, right? You should have gone to the manager of my manager as opposed to their manager. And then it got worse. He started to blame me in meetings for things. He started all of these microaggressions. And in my mind, I'm like, but I was just trying to help the female engineer. This is what I talk about, where you need to be very mindful of these things because it wasn't there in the beginning. It wasn't obvious. It's only when I had mentioned this and the issues, everything blew up. And there was another time when one of the Scrum Masters, he didn't like the tone that I had mentioned in an email chain. Email chain and a tone.
They use smiley faces and emojis and exclamation points and overly, And that's so silly.
I'll never forget what he wrote. I'm going to change the person's name because I'm not going to obviously name names. So there was no Fred. I didn't work with a Fred. And he said, Fred, please talk to Karen. I don't like her tone. And this was in an email chain. And I thought,
like
am I being banished to the 1950s kitchen? What do you... Go talk to Karen.
Can you make us a sandwich, please, while the men do the real work?
I was really baffled. And then things happened, unfortunately. He didn't really change his tone. Again, we had to go through the hierarchy for him to listen. He actually ended up leaving. And I also ended up leaving as well for different... So for me, it was a really harsh lesson that I learned, that even though you do have offshore teams, just to be mindful of cultural differences, the way that maybe male and females are perceived. I like to think that we do live in a society where that shouldn't be an issue. But just from my experiences, and there's loads of examples I'm sure all of us can relate to. But I know when I started talking about it to women in my network, they had the same problems, same experiences. And I thought it was such a shame because I think I was very naive that I was like, I'm just helping another fellow engineer out. And it just exploded. Just cascaded.
So to be clear, this was a male engineer in India.
Yes.
A male leader in India working with a team in India. And you were in the UK at the time. And also, you are of Sri Lankan descent, but you grew up in the UK, right?
I'm of Indian descent.
Oh, you're Indian. Okay,
no,
sorry.
I gave an example of Sri Lanka because I have a Sri Lankan friend, and they have
my mistake.
Christianity and Hinduism in India.
So you are of Indian descent, but you grew up in the UK, right?
So I'm second generation British. My grandparents are immigrants.
Right.
Born in India. Let's just do it that way.
Yeah, so what I'm getting at, though, and this is maybe an interesting thing to note, is a minority in a country like the UK, you're still going to maybe adopt the cultural norms of that country because your parents grew up here, you grew up here, for all intents and purposes, right? You are essentially part of that Western culture. And even though you are of Indian descent, you don't necessarily share the same cultural norms, right? And I'm asking this, by the way, I'm not telling you, I'm asking. You wouldn't say that you share necessarily the same cultural norms as far as class and castes and things like that they have in India, where it's much more, as you mentioned,
that's
hierarchical
correct.
And rigid in that sense. And so it's interesting to think about this just from, and I'm curious how you approach this, like and I guess you just told us this little anecdote, which helps, I think, explain how you approach it. But you're approaching it from Western culture. We're all the same. Everybody has the same value. Like,
treating
help
people
this other person
equally, I think, is what you're trying to say, which... To be fair,
but wasn't accepted in the other culture.
Which, to be fair, I think in theory we like to think that everybody accepts equality, but I know in reality that's not always the case.
Yeah,
right?
Like, think about that and how. And I'm curious, in that example, that woman receptive of that.
He was very grateful that I was trying to help her do something, because it sounded like to me she had spoken to him about this, but he wasn't listening.
Interesting.
And that she couldn't tell anyone about what was happening. I think people could tell that she was a bit worried, but she was grateful that I was trying to help and to do something. which is really interesting because at the time my mentor said that she said you should never have approached him directly. You should have gone through management. And I think, again, that just adds to another layer of office politics, because in my mind, it's I have a good relationship with him. Why wouldn't I talk to him? Why do I have to go through these other routes, right? So it's just something to always be mindful of.
Right.
It was an interesting lesson learned.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think it's worth thinking about. And the reason why I bring this up is I think for white people often have good intentions. And they'll say, oh, I'm going to help this person. I'm going to do this thing. But then there's cultural norms that I think we often, and I hate to tie this to like imperialism, right? But the white savior coming in and, oh, we're going to convert you to Christianity to save your soul because we care about your soul. But we're really like killing your culture and all these things. We're murdering all these people. And this sort of imperial mindset, because I'm curious from a minority's perspective, like how you see that, if that's actually helpful in a way, or is that we're going to help, we're going to come in, we're going to save this thing. I use the example of converting your culture to Christianity from whatever you were practicing before. In the corporate world, we're obviously not doing that, but I often feel like taking that stance, like the Western way is the right way, and the way that your team does it or the way that your culture does it is the wrong way, and that's the implication. And I'm just curious, how is that perceived?
That's a really good question.
Helpful?
My fundamental values, just treat people with respect and to treat people equally. But I also recognize that there are some people in the world who don't do that. They see men as, is it superior to women? So for me, I always try to speak up where I see that there's either an injustice going on, or I try to give support where I can. It's a difficult one because, as we know, the UK has a very complicated history with its empire and Commonwealth. It's a hard one because I think sometimes through the media, it is portrayed as the Western way is the right way. And I wonder if that's to do with the development of countries, being educated, and that isn't to say if you're not educated that you're not spoken for, but obviously the two interlink. I've had folks who have worked with me and they said, how did you get to the UK? Like, how can I do that? And I thought, I have no idea how to help you because it wasn't even me. Like, it was 2 generations back, and that access doesn't even exist anymore. Right? I think it comes down to respect. And I think regardless of what people think is the right way or the wrong way, when you start to be disrespectful, then that's the wrong way. That's the way that I see it. So it's not about my way is right or your way is right, or if you're not going to treat other people with respect, or if you're going to be condescending, or if you're going to start gaslighting people, then that's obviously the wrong way to go about doing things.
Yeah, no, I think it's fair. And I know your perspective is one perspective of obviously many different perspectives. But I asked the question because the thing we're talking about today is getting the perspective of a woman and a minority in the corporate, I was going to say corporate America, but you're not in America. The corporate, whatever you call it, I don't know, the global corporate culture or whatever. I think the reason why I want to have this conversation is for people like me to hear a perspective that is different from theirs so that they can then do better and be better. And so that's the reason why I ask. And I often think we run into this issue where maybe intentions are good, but it ends up not always working out because we don't take those cultural differences into account before we do a thing. And so that's the reason why I ask.
That's actually a very good point. Stereotypes need to go out the window.
Sure.
Because sometimes I feel as if things are made worse is because people are stereotyping. For example, sometimes I get stereotyped that I speak really good English.
You were born, yeah.
Do you know what? So when someone said that to me, I replied as a joke because I try not to, and people know this, so I'm allowed to say this. I always say how I'm a non-judgmental person. All my friends are going to laugh, but I always say that. So when people make these comments, I'm like, okay, let me think of it from their perspective. Maybe they went through the school system, it was only about their country only, or like maybe they haven't been exposed to the wider world, right? So I believe if everyone had the mindset of educating each other, some of these issues wouldn't even exist, because then you would stop taking things personally and you would acknowledge the other person's way and how they get to that point. So if someone said to me that I speak really good English, I said, I hope so. I was born here. And they started laughing and I started laughing. Do you see what I mean? Like you diffuse the situation. So I think a lot of us need to also not take things personally sometimes and just remember that just don't stereotype is what I would say. For example, I remember someone at a company, she said, what do you think of the Indian caste system? I had no idea. I only know about the British class system. I have no idea. I didn't grow up in India, didn't go to school there. I don't know the impact on me because I've never been there. I've read articles around how other people in the lower caste system and when they go to work, like how they're bullied and how it's used against them. And so I can only go off what's out there. But I feel like she asked me that because she thought I knew. I probably know just as much as you.
Yeah.
I think when you start to stereotype, that's where a lot of these problems come from.
This is advice that I often give, and I would love to get your perspective here because I've been told that this is not helpful advice, and I'd love to hear what you think. But generally speaking, when it comes to things like this, what I often try to say, and this is, again, I think coming from my privilege as a cisgendered white dude, but I often say assume positive intent, right? And especially with people that we work with, I don't think for the most part that people are bigots or racist or misogynist or sexist or anything like that. I think there are certainly certain underlying biases that we all have that might appear in certain ways, but I also don't think they're doing it actively to. That said, that is my perspective as a cisgendered white dude. And I have gotten the feedback that isn't always the case. And there are many people that have had direct opposite experiences at work where people were actively trying to undermine them. And I'm curious, when we talk about office politics and navigating office politics, is that just something that I say from the perspective of a privileged white guy? Do you share that insight or do you feel like that's not true and unhelpful? I'm curious, what has been your experience with that? Is assume positive intent something you can actually safely do, or do you think that's the wrong approach?
That's a hard one. The reason why I say that's a hard one is if you've done, I think it's Myers-Briggs, 16 personalities. So I'm an ENTJ. Probably the worst one you can get because it's not common in women. Not only am I a woman, I'm brown, and I'm also an ENTJ. Can you imagine all of that and how much that would disruption that would cause?
I am here. Let's take a step back. Could you help us understand what that is? They aren't familiar.
I feel like I should read up on this. I did this test 2 years ago. So I think it's 16 personalities. And the idea is that if you all were to take this test, it's a range of different personality types. You could be a commander or you could be an introvert. That's not one of them. But there's all these different, I'm going to use the word characters, where they have personalities. And the idea is that you learn about your strengths, your weaknesses, you learn about what you like and what you don't like. It's not 100% accurate, but the idea is that you get an idea of who you are as a person. And if someone gives their personality type as well, to some extent, you would have an understanding of how to best interact with them because they're the way they like to be approached or how they like to be spoken to. Characters all mean different things. You can have an extrovert, an introvert. You can have thinker, judger. I don't know what the N is, but please. I'm not doing this a very good justice, but go research
No, you did a good job of explaining.
So it tells you your personality type and it gives you a profile on that personality type. When I found out I was an ENTJ, and I've done this test 4 times, and I still get the same one each and every time. Okay. When I read it and it says, yeah, this isn't a common personality and you're not really going to find someone like you in the workplace. I was like, what do you mean? So not only am I a woman and then I'm brown and now I have this personality type where I'm unlikely to find someone like me in the workplace. Like that's not really a recipe for success. And then the test also goes into if it's a common personality trait, the likelihood of you finding someone like you in the workplace. So I forgot what the original question was.
Assuming positive intent.
Yes.
Something a woman or minority should do, or do you feel like leads you to be taken advantage of?
I would say it's twofold. So for someone like me, I really hope people think positive intent because as an ENTJ, I am quite direct. I'm quite straight to the point. People find that a bit too assertive or people I've actually been offended by that. So in my case, if it's positive at 10, yes, please do. But I have seen other personality types where they may be a bit shy, or they won't be able to stand up for themselves, or maybe the way that they grew up, or maybe culturally, or even religion, or anything that comes into it. When you do assume positive at 10, you can be taken advantage of. So I think for me, it really depends on the situation. And what I would say is, it just comes back to, if someone's going to take advantage of someone else, I want to make sure that I'm standing up for that person, because I know that they can't stand up for themselves. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
I think you can only assume positive intent so far.
Right.
It's a good thing. But then if it gets to the point where you're taking advantage of it, then obviously that's not a good thing.
Yeah. So what I've changed was, I say, try to assume positive intent, in that better than anyone else what your specific situation is. And if you feel in your gut that this is something that is not right and is a sign of something deeper, you know better than anyone else. So try to assume positive intent. And then also, there's patterns. If it happens continuously and over, it could be that maybe those people are ignorant of this situation and they just don't realize they're doing it, and you could have a conversation and change it, or maybe it's something deeper there as well. Try to assume. That's what I say. So I love your perspective, though. And I think it's one of those things where maybe the worst thing you could do is just assume, and I feel like I'm mansplaining to the audience, because that's not the intent. But as a privileged white guy, it's definitely easier for me to say this. But if you went and just assumed people are like on you all the time and they're against you, I think you're going to have a very hard time in a professional setting, whether it's a startup or a corporate environment. I feel like you can't always assume the worst.
No, but you said something that was very key. If it's a repeated behavior, positive intent goes out the window. Like, I have friends who are also women of color, minorities as well. They then become in denial. So I think it's good to assume positive intent at first, but like you said, if it's a repeated behavior and pattern, if you're then going to go in denial about it, I think that's where you either need to have people who can help you, because obviously that person's taking advantage, right? So I remember working at a company where gaslighting was just normal. And it wasn't until I spoke to someone else, they're like, oh, Karen, I've been gaslighted. And then we spoke to a few more colleagues, and it turns out like we're all being gaslighted, right? So positive intent goes out the window. And I think also it's a combination of your personality going to put up with it. I think at that point, you need to have allies who can help you. Because I do agree with what you said. Positive intent is great as a first step, but if it becomes a repeated behavior, positive intent goes out the window. Right. And that's where you need to recognize that. A better job. Like, for example, I remember being in a meeting where I kept getting spoken all over. And there was I'm going to say cisgender white male, is that correct? He was amazing at this. And in some of those meetings, he's like, oh, Karen, you were saying something. Can you go back to that, please? And I was like, yes. So we need more of you in the workplace.
Yeah.
Because even smallest things can make a really huge difference. And I think we need to have allies as well, because there's less of us in the workforce, right? So we need to have more allies as well. And I think when that happened, where he circled back and he said, hey, Karen, continue on with your point/conversation, to me, that's really important as well. So to answer your question, positive intent is great as a first step. But then if it becomes a repeated behavior and pattern, that goes out the window. And then just make sure that you always have allies or someone who can help you if you start to go through something with someone or some people.
Yeah, I love it. You've talked a lot about dealing with conflict and things like that, but you brought up something in our pre-interview chat that I think is really important for people to know. And these are the ideas, just red flags, things that you start to see that make you realize that you are in a bad situation and what you might be able to do about it. So I want to talk a little bit about this. You talked about the difference between red flags in an interview versus after you've joined the team. I want to hear about this, and I think this is something really important. You're a designer, researcher, whatever you are, professional. You have the opportunity to understand some of the culture before you actually accept the offer. I want to hear from you. what are some red flags that a candidate might be able to identify before they even accept the job to know that they might be treated differently when they get this job?
Oh, I feel like this is a harder one because I personally think that people do not treat interviews as a two-way process. I do believe that candidates should be doing more because at the end of the day, if that's a company you want to work for, you also have to recognize, is it a good fit? Because during the interview process, sometimes I like to ask questions more around the team. Can you tell me about a time when a team member gave feedback and you implemented it? Can you give me a time when you created more of a feedback culture? Like, it's really around the team and the individuals, because you can't really ask, can you tell me the makeup of women and men and the skin color? You can't really ask that.
Is that like a cultural thing? Just maybe England or UK is different from the US? Because I could easily see somebody in the US saying, how many women do you have on your team? What is your executive leadership team? How many? Yeah.
What I'm trying to say is you then can't really go into specifics, but you can ask men and women ratio and you can ask why. That's also a question that I like to ask as well, just so that I want to understand if I'm joining a team, am I the first female? If I'm the first female, that means that I need to make inroads. If I'm not the first female, that means that they've already made the inroads. And how do I contribute that and maintain it, right? The questions that I like to come from the perspective of is more around listening to your team members, because let's say I've asked a question of, can you tell me the breakdown or ratio between women and men? Let me try to understand if they listen. When was the time that you implemented feedback? When was the time when you progressed a woman in your team, right? So when you ask these very specific questions, that's when you will start to get your red flags. If they avoid the question, if they're unwilling to engage, if they have no sense of accountability, if they are like muttering and trying to change the subject, right? So those are your red flags.
As a job hunter, then I think most people think they do. Right? You are not there to just convince them that you are the perfect fit. They have to also convince you that they are the perfect fit for you. And so I think if you take that mindset, you go into these conversations not just trying to say and do whatever they want you to say and do, but that you also try to say the right things that you know you believe so that you see how they react, which is in itself a red flag, like you said. So that's something I think a lot of people, they just think that their job as a job candidate is to impress the hell out of the company and the hiring team, but they're also there to impress you. And I think a lot of people ignore that fact. So let's ask this question, because the thing with interviews is you've got maybe an hour, time is limited, and people lie, let's face it. You might not know until you get the actual job that this is maybe a toxic environment and you're in a position that you didn't want to be in. So I'm curious, once you get the job, you join the team, what are some red flags to look out for there?
No, it'd be very tragic.
On the show, we could talk about it.
There are some companies that I've worked for have been amazing for diversity and really have the right, I don't know what the word is, or the right guardrails in place. Whereas there are some companies that I've worked for which were the devil in disguise. So I remember, I guess red flags in general would be lack of support. Again, going back to the unwillingness. Also an element of secrecy. When things are not transparent and they're very embedded in secrecy, that's something to look out for. When it becomes a case of us versus them, that's something to also look out for. And then for me, the biggest one, just your intuition. So for example, there was a company that I interviewed for, and from my understanding is that I didn't negotiate my salary. So the hiring manager apparently, allegedly, or what I was told, was they had rejected people in the interview process if they asked for more money or if they were trying to negotiate their salary. Now you're probably thinking, there's Karen, she's probably going to be grateful for what she got. I didn't actually negotiate my salary. And then another thing that happened during the interview process was that the hiring manager was saying, we want people to come in to voice their opinions more, to talk about research a bit more. We don't do enough of it. So when I joined the company, oh my goodness, stuff just hit the fan. I gave feedback. People didn't like that. I then found out that the hiring manager was very secretive and, it was just the whole shebang.
Oh, wow.
So for me, to cut a very long story short, is that no environment is worth sacrificing your mental health for. I think, at least for me and my friends who I know, we're all women and we're brown. I think sometimes we have this tendency to be a bit more resilient. Oh no, push through it. Don't put your mental health first, because mental health wasn't really a thing growing up, if that makes sense. It's not really a thing. I'm sure it's better now, but growing up, it wasn't really a discussion point in our household or to anyone else. So I think there is this underlyingness of where, and it goes back to, people will take advantage of you because they know that you're willing to put up with it because you're not going to play the mental health card. And I think for me, I learned the hard way that unfortunately people lie during the interview process, and then you start and then all of a sudden you're impacted. And then people gaslight you. People start ignoring you because you've given feedback. But then you were told that you are able to give feedback. And then it's like your fault. Yeah, red flags, them versus us, secrecy, the lack of transparency, the lack of trust, the lack of safety. If you also hear bad things around your team and your manager, that's a huge red flag. So unfortunately, when I joined the team, everyone kept talking about each other behind each other's back. There was a lot of gossiping, undermining. It was awful. And I think that's made even worse when you're a person of color, because at least for me, like I said, failure isn't an option. And then you get taken advantage of, right? I remember once I went to one of my manager, and she was Caucasian female, and trusted her in sharing some information. Like I was going through with another colleague, and she turned around and blamed it on me. I wonder if she would have done that. So there's also a barrier, and I know we spoke about this before, and I don't know if you've ever faced this, but you're always questioning yourself. Is it? Because obviously if it's with men, you're like, oh, is it? I'm a woman. But when it's with a woman, then it's like, oh, but is it because I'm brown? Or is it because of this? Is it because of that? You're always questioning yourself. And I don't think that other people realize how much we question ourselves. But what I'm saying is, when you get red flags, at least for me, I was always questioning myself as opposed to other things that I should have been questioning. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious though, what about a red flag as it relates to being a minority, and a red flag for like keeping an eye out for something like discrimination or stereotypes or things like that? Are there red flags? Because a lot of this is not going to be overt.
It's very subtle.
I'm curious, any red flags that you've experienced
For me,
because specifically of being a woman
I
that
think
you
for
want
me
to
it's
call
the
out?
undermining. If I've said something, but then someone else has said the same thing, whether they're male or female, I've had that happen to me before. And I was like, but I said that. So why didn't you take me seriously when I said it? But if it was my Caucasian male or female colleague, they got the praise. And then again, you go into the spiral of, oh, did I do something wrong? Was it me? Another one, the undermining and the ignoring. But I think also when they start to make jokes. They start to make jokes, whether it's about the cuisine or whether it's about maybe the clothes that you would wear. And then I think, like you said, they brush it off as a joke, and you're just like, I don't know. And I think there's an undertone there occurring. I don't think that's acceptable.
Yeah.
I think that's happened a few times to me, where they make it seem like you're the problem. And then again, if someone else was to raise it, then all of a sudden it's not a problem anymore. And you're just thinking, but why did you make me feel this way about this? So I think a combination of kind of the subtleness of the jokes, the undermining, the gaslighting, the ignoring. For me, they're very subtle. I don't want to say microaggressions. I don't think that's the right. I think a lot of them are just very subtle.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and it's crazy to me that people do that kind of stuff. as a manager, as a UX leader, as a leader in general, or even just as a dude on a team, I just can't imagine making jokes like that and treating people that way. And it blows my mind. And I think that's for me too. I don't think that way. And so I think one of my challenges is assuming other people also don't. There's a bias of you assume everyone thinks like you, right? And
I know what you mean.
And so you just assume other people also think that way. But then when it actually happens, you're like, that can't be what they think. What is going on? It's got to be something else. And so that's for me, I don't know. That's a really hard one for me.
Do you know what it is? I don't mean the same. I never mean anything in a horrible way. And my friends started to laugh at that because I say that all the time. I think sometimes there's this complexity of, I don't need to explain it. Okay, so sometimes when I go to work, I dress very corporate because I like dressing corporate. So I like wearing the collared shirt, the jumper. I have had a few people who are Caucasian look me up and down. And I think and I've seen this happen to other women of color as well. And it's, oh, why is she dressing like that? Do you know what I mean?
Interesting. Would you mean like they assumed you would dress down? Okay.
So
edit it out if it doesn't make sense.
So it's, oh, like she's brown and she's, like, if I look different, everyone looks different. It's, oh, why is she dressing like that? I don't know. I feel like all my brown friends would get this. I feel like you're not getting, and I don't know how to explain it to you.
You know, I don't think that's because your feelings are invalid. I feel like I just haven't experienced that personally. I don't know.
Snobby people.
Is this could be like maybe a British thing with like posh people and classes? I think
it
I don't know.
is.
I also feel like I don't hang out with people like that. And like the people that I work with, because where I've always worked, I have worked in big corporate environments, but they've always been like t-shirt and shorts kind of places. You know?
Oh, okay.
Even when I was at GE, we would have executives that came in from the corporate office in Boston to work. You have to. That's like dress code.
Yeah.
And they would come to the New Orleans office and they'd be like, wow, everybody's in t-shirts. I love it. I don't have to wear my suit. This is great. And it was very dressed down, like jeans and t-shirts. And even like over the summer, people wear shorts and stuff. Yeah. They did say no open-toed shoes, so you weren't supposed to wear like sandals. But anyway, I don't know. I haven't experienced that at work personally. I have to be honest.
So the idea behind it is, it goes back to stereotyping, which I think is where a lot of these problems stem from. And I also think a lot of these problems stem from like the superior and inferior complex.
You're at a lower level thing?
Yes.
See, again, this is me as a dude. I personally have never had someone look me up and, what are you doing?
How
like
dare
underling?
You be successful? You go back to your where you came from.
I don't know if this is an American thing where we Americans assume we're flat. We know that this is not the case, by the way, but we like to assume the melting pot, everyone's equal.
I didn't know what the melting pot is.
What's the right word? Not nepotism, merit-based. We're all merit-based and you earn what you get and things like that. Maybe I'm sure people in the United States are like, Jeremy, what the hell are you talking about? And maybe LA might be a little different in New York, but I don't know.
That's really interesting when you made reference to what are some things that happen as a woman of color and minority. I think there is this element of know your place. And I think that's why sometimes we're reluctant to give feedback or to speak up or to maybe correct someone if they're saying something incorrect in a meeting. There is that I don't know if it's conscious or unconscious, but I know myself and my friends have definitely experienced that. And going back to that example where I've had people look me up and down, and it's a shame that still exists in society because I feel like that goes beyond snobbiness. I feel like that becomes a case of, oh, why are you dressing like that? Hello? I'm so baffled. And
so here's it. Yeah, so I would love to hear their perspective as an American or even a British person who's moved to the States or someone from the States who's moved to England or UK and experienced this. But I listened to this history podcast called the British History Podcast, right? And it's a history of England and stuff, right? Yes. And so there were laws that were passed in like the 1300s that were actually would limit what peasants could wear because peasants would start trying to, as like they got richer and we moved away from the feudal, I wasn't there, but they moved away from the feudal system. They were able to then buy nicer clothes. And then you could walk into a pub or something and look like a nobleman, but not be noble. And so they actually passed laws that banned them from wearing fur or gold or whatever. And each class could only wear a certain thing. And the rich people, the nobles, could wear gold and fur and silk, but the peasants couldn't. And in the United States, obviously, we're very much, we left the UK for a reason, right? So anyway,
What I
you
will
weren't
say,
there. Don't
what
worry
I
about
will
it. Your
say to
family
that
wasn't there.
is, and again, I'm actually very curious to see if anyone, because I've always said this before, even, I know we've had this conversation around how UX is different in the States and in Europe and in the UK. I think this is a very good example of the UK does have a very complex history. They conquered India for 300 years.
Sure, yeah.
They've butchered other countries' partitions, let's face it. A complex history. And then when you throw in people such as myself who were born and raised here or a few generations back have come to the UK, in our minds, we're part of the country that we're in. And it's only when we get to the working environment where you actually see that it's very different. Sometimes a question I get asked is like, where are you from? And I feel as if my counterparts, my peers, whatever you want to call them,
Peers, sure, yeah.
they don't get asked that question. So when I say that I was born and raised in London, they're like, oh, okay, so where are you from?
Yeah.
I understand they're being curious, but I think it goes back to, okay, so then word the question differently.
I was going to say, because I asked that question, just having, I like to have one-on-ones where we just bullshit and talk about nothing and stuff originally or something like that, which, because I asked that question because like I like to consider myself Italian, even though my last name is Miller, and I love talking. Oh, my grandparents came from Italy, and I still have family there, and my family keep in touch with the Italian Di Vincentis and stuff. I wouldn't be like I'm not from, and my parents aren't even from Italy. So anyway, I like to ask that question just as a point of conversation, and it's more, where's your family from? Anyway, I don't know. That's just again how
I've
you
had
word it,
another
I think
one. To be fair, I've never seen someone else be asked this question. It's like, how many languages do you speak? And then they're always surprised when I say English is my first language. Just like,
really? I mean, you clearly have like accent.
I think if I'm honest, a lot of this just stems from, I don't want to say lack of education, but I do feel that people need to be more mindful of these things. I mean, maybe that does come from education. I don't know. Because I do feel as if once you leave secondary school or university, people stop learning. Because if you grew up in an environment where there were no women of color and you work with them in the workforce, but what's your point of reference? There isn't one. And then companies have DE&I training, but I do think it's very different doing training and then interacting in person, right? So if we think about the UK, there are some towns that probably don't have people of color, right? But it becomes an issue when you enter the workforce and then all of a sudden you have all of women minorities and then they don't know what to do because they don't have a point of reference, right? And I live in the city, so I was with everyone growing up, if that makes diversity. But there are some areas in the UK that are not diverse, which is okay, which is fine because people live where they want to live. It does become a slight issue when you then come into the workforce and you've not come across women or women minorities before. What do you do then? Do you continue in your own ignorance, or do you want to try and learn, or do you... And then I think this is where a lot of these problems stem from, where people start to be condescending or gaslighting, or they cut you off, or they create this environment of fear or know your place. I think the main one, if you said to me, Karen, as a woman of color minority, like what's the biggest one you can resonate with, is definitely know your place. I feel like talk to any woman and woman of color minority, they will tell you that's something that they have 100% experienced, to know your place.
Yeah, that one I would love to hear more from Americans on how they feel about that.
Well, America's a land of immigrants.
I was gonna say I hope, look, there's got to be places in New York, LA, Miami, or these places where rich people congregate in their super yachts and their fancy high-rise flats and shit and their private clubs.
But it's not also limited to rich people, right? It can be anyone.
I don't know. I like to think like a middle-class person wouldn't think that about somebody, but I don't know. That's your perspective and your experience, and certainly that's like the experience you had. I don't know. I just hope America would treat people
Do you know what
with
you
a little
need? Do you know what
better-
you
I
need?
don't know.
You need somebody who is the American
Yes.
equivalent of me.
Yeah, what you mean? Yeah.
Equivalent, and ask them, because another whole issue is our country's histories are completely different.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. All right, cool. We have had you for a long time. This has been an awesome interview. There were some things we wanted to talk about we didn't get to. That's all right. I would love to have you back on at some point and talk more about this. This is such an important topic, and I think everybody should hear it, especially people like me, cisgender white dudes need to hear this kind of stuff, someone's perspective that is not theirs. I think that's so important. Before we get out of here, I got a few questions I like to ask all my guests to help our listeners get to know our guests a little bit better if you have done it. But I'm going to give you another maybe 10 minutes to think about it. Before we get out of here, any closing thoughts that you would like everybody to know? If you would, actually, let me rephrase this. Any closing thoughts, not for the people like you, because they've experienced it, the people like me that you want your middle-aged white dude colleagues to know. Fair enough. Okay, anything for the people that are maybe not like you, that you want them to know about working with women or minorities in the workplace?
The first thing I would say is don't stereotype, right? I remember reading an article around, I think it was a black woman from Africa. What country was she from? Was it Kenya? She was from... And she went to an American university, and they asked her, like, what music do you listen to? And she said Mariah Carey, and they were shocked, which I thought was hilarious. The main story to take away from that is just don't stereotype, because when you stereotype, you're also setting on the wrong foot with that person. And as we know, respect and trust does take time to build. And the last thing you want to do is to start off on the wrong foot, right? Some people are more forgiving than others, like such as myself. When I talk about my colleague said I was Karen, he's, I wasn't expecting that name. Just don't stereotype, number one.
Yeah.
Number two, always try to uplift, right? So I spoke around allies in meetings. When someone was walking over me and cutting me off, I noticed that they didn't do that to anybody else, and they came back to me. So having allies is really important. And the third thing is, it's just creating a sense of trust and security and safeness. I think that's incredibly important, and that's probably applicable to everyone. But sometimes we feel that we have to prove our worth more. Sometimes we have to work twice as hard. Sometimes we have to go above and beyond to Jupiter just to even be considered for things, right? So it's also about understanding and also educating yourself as well. We always talk about women in STEM and women in engineering, or women here, women there, which is great. But then when you look at the low-level detail of women of color, why aren't they in these places? Clearly they're here. They exist in their numbers. Why aren't we getting them here? Is it because of our lack of understanding? And I think a lot of this just come from educating ourselves. So a combination of avoiding stereotypes, being allies, being supportive, and also creating a safe space where we can voice our concerns. Because if we can't voice our concerns, how are we all meant to become better?
I love it. Be an ally, lift people up, and just don't be a jerk. I think that's the other thing too. Just don't be an asshole. I feel like you know when you're being a dick. Just don't be a dick. I don't know. Anyway, that's my personal opinion. But if you can, for the love of God, just don't make a joke that you think might be... If you think it might be offensive, don't say it. If you think it might be offensive, just shut up. Just don't say it. I don't know. Anyway. All right, Karen. So I've had you on for a long time now. I've given you now 1 hour, 31 minutes, and 17 seconds to think about these questions. Are you ready for these questions?
No, but go.
First up, what is your favorite non-design book?
Okay, so I feed into finance recently, and there's a book by Female Invest, which I have forgotten the name of.
Let's see.
Female Invest. Go check out their books. I think that's helped me a lot, so let's just go with that.
Girls Just Want to Have Funds. Feminist Guide to Investing. That's
the
it?
One, yes.
Oh, I just Googled. That was the first one on Google. All right, cool. Girls Just Want to Have Funds. I like that. All right. That's a very pragmatic choice, by the way. And
I could talk about The Kite Runner, but that's a very depressing book.
What is your favorite non-design podcast?
That's really hard because I listen to a lot of design podcasts, but I'm into nutrition. And there's a brand called, so they have patches that you can put onto your arm and you can measure your glucose.
Oh, wow.
They have a podcast, which I've forgotten his name. But Google Zoe and Stephen Bartlett is also an investor. Their podcasts are really great around nutrition.
Let's see.
Oh, you're good.
Yeah, well, this is Zoe, I don't know, Science and Nutrition Podcast.
Yes.
It's just, that's a very boring name, but
Very informative.
all right. What is your favorite meal? This could be something you've cooked, something your grandma used to cook, something at a restaurant, favorite meal.
It's going to be really specific, so please do bear with me. So if you said to me, what's the one thing I could eat every day? I'm not going to say in Punjabi, but I'll say it in English. So it's rice and yogurt. But the rice is long grain rice, not short grain, not the plastic rice, long grain rice. Cook it the Punjabi way, which is ghee, spices, bay leaves, all of that shebang. And then you put the peas in, the water, cook it. Then it's fluffy, amazing. And then the yogurt, you fry mini gram flour balls.
Okay.
So you fry mini gram flour balls and then you put them in the yogurt and then you put the salt and the pepper in and the spices and then shebang, rice and yogurt.
And do you eat it over the rice? Separate
No, you eat it over the rice.
Oh, I like that. I'm going to have to try that
I feel like
out.
I did
You know
not
the thing,
explain that properly.
No, it's good. The thing like kind of bums me out about living in the U.S. is we've got a ton of Indian restaurants.
They're not legit.
India, giant country. It's like saying American food. What does that mean? Is it a hot dog? Is it a steak? Is it barbecue? Is it pizza? Is it spaghetti? What the hell does that mean? Indian food, it's always the exact same menu, no matter where you go. It's like tikka masala. It's like some kind of curry. They might have shrimp vindaloo. They have naan. The 5 things are going to be exactly the same on every single Indian restaurant in the United States.
That's
I have never
disappointing.
heard of that dish. And
What?
I've never heard of it.
What
The
do
yogurt
you
and rice?
mean?
I've never heard of it.
So
Never
what's
had
the
it.
yogurt offering that they give you?
They would have, what do they call it? God, you're putting me on the spot. There's a yogurt dip that usually sometimes it has cucumber, sometimes it has tomatoes.
Wait,
Raita?
Raita.
Raita? Yeah.
Oh my God.
That would be like the only yogurt restaurant.
They have-
at least the ones I've gone to. I mean,
No,
there's
they have
probably,
that
I'm sure I'm
dish.
missing a lot of really great Indian restaurants. But
The gram flour one. Chef's kiss.
so in the in the UK, do you guys have a lot more diversity in your Indian restaurants there than we do here?
In London.
Yeah, London's like New York. I'm sure you would find an Indian restaurant in New York with that dish, but you're not going to find it there.
I
can
remember
tell
you
that right
saying,
now.
what was the podcast episode you did around seafood? And you said that they had to import it by plane.
Yeah,
that was
well,
a
when we
known
first
dish?
moved to Cincinnati, I asked the guy, like, where do you get good seafood around here? And he was like, where do they get their seafood from around here? And he goes, the airport. Yeah, because they got to ship it in because there's no, I mean, there's a river. You can get catfish.
There's a
I
lot
wouldn't eat the
of-
catfish out of the river here.
There's a lot of Indian dishes that are chef's kiss.
Yeah. Chinese is the same way. Like you go to a Chinese restaurant, it's always like General Tso's chicken. You know, stuff like it's like always this like beef and broccoli. Like that's like Chinese food. But
I'm
China, it's the same
vegetarian.
thing. Okay.
I feel as if people miss vegetarian food, which is amazing.
There's probably a lot less vegetarians, at least where I live. I don't know. It depends on the region, but mostly meat eaters around here. What is your favorite vacation spot?
Okay, so I don't travel much because I'm a workaholic,
You work too much.
and also because I haven't traveled enough, I'm gonna say where I would like to go.
Okay.
I've always
Yeah,
wanted to
okay.
go
I'll allow
to. I feel like I'm gonna butcher the name.
Yeah.
I would love to go to French Polynesia.
Ooh. I love you there too.
I would love to go to Zanzibar.
Yeah. Even a place like cheap once you're there, but like paying for the flights. That's the problem with why I've never gone to Europe for fun, at least.
I
The
live in
flights are so
Europe,
goddamn expensive.
And I don't even go to Europe. No, I'm being serious. If
Yeah.
someone can help me with this. So I have loads of people who talk about Europe, going to Europe, and even some really lovely folks who I've spoken to on LinkedIn. And I'm just like, I don't even go to Europe. And I live in London.
Is there a reason why? Like why?
Do you know what? It's a combination of money, growing up mentality, the Asianness. And I'm sure many people can relate to that. The fear. Not the fear of traveling. This is a different type of fear, which we can talk about offline.
Or like
no,
going
it's
off.
a different type of fear.
Okay,
It's,
all right,
it's
we'll
not
talk
worth
about it
going
offline.
into.
All right, last question. What is your favorite design tool that is not Figma?
Okay, I have 2 answers. Am I allowed to give 2 answers?
I'll allow it. Sure.
So
It's my show. I do what I want.
what I found to be incredibly valuable when you're in the workplace is visualization. So Miro for that.
Oh, yes.
And then if it's me in terms of processing and understanding and brainstorming and exploration, I would say the good old paper and pencil.
I love a good paper and pencil answer. I'm the same way. I actually have this really fancy pen that I bought, which I probably spent way too much on, and I carried around everywhere.
Is that a Parker pen?
No, it is a James brand pen.
I don't know who that is.
Yeah, it's fancy. It's like stainless steel, and it's really heavy, and it's like, but the action on it is like really nice, and it's like the right size. It's like I have like other pens that like, where'd they go?
Not
yeah,
the
like
same
one,
experience.
And look how much thicker. Look how much thicker this pen is than this one, and it's like thin. I just love it, and it's like heavy. It's got a good weight to it. I splurged. I know, but I will never buy another pen in my life, though.
Wait, what's that in pounds?
I'm about 80 pounds.
No, I think it's 69 pounds.
80 US dollars to pounds.
Because Parker pens are incredibly expensive in the
64.
UK. No.
Yeah.
No, the proper fancy ones, they go up to like 60, 70, 80 pounds.
Oh, yeah. But I've been subscribing to this idea of less but better recently.
Yes.
Right? So like I don't need a bunch of crap, but I'm willing to spend more on nice crap if it lasts a long time. So
You should do that with your clothes.
I have started. Yeah, this shirt actually. I don't want to tell you how much I spent on this shirt, but this shirt it's like really high quality.
Is that organic cotton?
It's like it's not cotton actually, because it's like
linen?
it's like it's plastic. I'm sure it's like nylon. Not nylon. What is the right word?
Polyester.
Some kind of like polyester blend. Like it's lightweight and you can wear it a bunch before you wash it. And it's antimicrobial and stuff.
Wow.
I tried to get some merino wool shirts. They were like really expensive, but they all got like holes in them. I got a bunch of little holes in the merino wool. I'm like, why am I spending like $70 on a shirt? They're like, yeah, they get little like baby holes.
As in
like,
after you
merino
washed
wool.
it?
Yeah, well, merino wool is fragile. And
Sounds
so
like you should be
actually,
hand washing it.
I did hand wash it. I was very careful. I don't know. So, all right. It's been amazing talking to you. We have had a lot of fun. I hope people have learned a lot, and we've laughed a little bit talking about a very serious topic, but I really appreciate you coming on. Before we get out of here, let everybody know where they can find you and send all their evil, dirty...
Does it exist in America?
It's funny.
Right, can I just
if you're
address
listening
this?
and voted for your soul.
Can I just address this? So when Donald Trump was elected the first time around in 2016, everybody kept apologizing. All the Americans kept apologizing to the British. And I was so confused. They said, we're really sorry. And you've just done the same thing again.
No, I was apologizing to the world, not the world. Everyone listening.
Okay.
We'll get out of here before this derails any further. Well, let everybody know. Did you say where they could find you?
No.
I wasn't even paying attention.
We're talking about...
Where to find you?
I
Too
have
much.
some amazing resources on the LinkedIn, on my profile. So yes, find me on LinkedIn. If you type in Karen Manhas, you should be able to find me.
All right. Thank you very much. This has been amazing. I really appreciate you coming on.